The best chance right now that Republicans have to win this next election is to cheat. And that's exactly what they're doing. Across the country, repressive voting laws are popping up in order to keep minority voters away from the polls. And thanks to the court packing of Republican politicians, these policies are getting the green light in spite of the fact that they are clear violations of the Voting Rights Act. And the battleground right now appears to be in North Carolina, and I have Howard Nations with me now to explain what's happening. Howard, the fight for voting rights in the United States, this is not obviously something that's just happened in the last couple years with all these regressive voting laws. You know, this really goes back to what Martin Luther King stood for and was fighting for decades ago. And unfortunately today, that fight is still raging on. So take us back through the history of this. You know, why are we still fighting the battle that we were fighting, 50 years ago?
You're absolutely right. Martin Luther King, in his 1957 speech called "Give Us the Ballot," referred to the fact that after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, there were nullification actions that were taken, particularly in the southern states. And he said that those nullification of voting rights, the result was, quote, all types of conniving methods were being used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. Now, Congress, under the 15th Amendment, has the power to enact laws to stop racial discrimination, particularly in voting, under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Those amendments were conditions for the South to rejoin the Union. They were in 1865 through 1870. 100 years later, we had Bloody Sunday on March 7th of 1965 in Selma, Alabama. And of course, Bloody Sunday was a precursor to the Voting Rights Act of '65, which LBJ signed six months after Selma. And the Voting Rights Act was actually the most successful civil rights law that was ever enacted by Congress. This is important. It was enacted on a bipartisan basis, and it had enforcement provisions in it that require that they be reauthorized. Now, they were reauthorized by Republican presidents. Nixon in '70, Reagan in '82, George W. in 2006, because voting rights were so fundamental to our identity as a free people that it was a bipartisan basis on a national level. Not so much in the states.
No, and so now today, we're talking about a fight for voting rights that's been going on for 150 years. Right. I mean, that's really taking it back to as you said, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, 150 years. And today, we still have Republican-controlled legislatures in the South that want to take us back in time to the 1840s, I guess, and restrict the vote from African Americans, from minorities of any kind, the elderly, whoever they can get their hands on. They want to prevent them from voting because those are typically Democratic voters. I mean, there is no question about why they're doing this. The question is, how are they doing this? So lay that out for us a little bit of what's taking place today.
Okay. The Voting Rights Act invalidated literacy tests, poll taxes, things of that nature. Section 2 of it banned discrimination in voting. Section 5 required that before a state could change their voting laws, they had to get approval from the federal government. And Section 4 said they couldn't change that until they had pre-clearance from the Justice Department. It was highly effective, and it worked for years because a state couldn't change until after the Justice Department approved it. However, in 2013, the Supreme Court of the United States in Shelby County versus Holder struck down Section 4, the pre-clearance provision, saying you no longer need pre-clearance from the federal government. You can pass anything you want to. It's not just about the African American vote. Republican voting discrimination attacks all minorities, especially Hispanics now because they're getting to be such a large number. It attacks students. It attacks the elderly. It attacks anyone who is likely to vote Democratic.
Well, and So right now there's really two battlegrounds for everything that's taking place. We have a huge fight going on in Texas. We have a huge fight going on in North Carolina. And part of the reason that these voting laws are being able to be put into place is because of another Republican practice of packing the courts. So they pack the courts, including the Supreme Court, with these Republican hack judges, and those judges uphold these regressive voting laws every single time. And that's why we're having such a huge fight right now in Texas and North Carolina. And I think it's important to point out that Texas, you and I have mentioned this in the past, it's not as red as people want to think that it is. The Republicans are desperately trying to keep it red through gerrymandering and voter ID laws, because if Texas were to ever turn into a blue state, we're talking every presidential election is going to the Democrats every time. So give us a little primer on what's happening with these two different fights here.
Well, in Texas, in a very important decision this year, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, the federal Fifth Circuit Court, which is after the Republican majority on the U.S. Supreme Court, the Fifth Circuit is the most conservative court in America. They held that the Texas ID law is discriminatory and violates Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Now, the way it came about, and this is pretty graphic, in 2010, the census showed that Texas was no longer a white majority state. The combination of Hispanics and African Americans and other minorities is now more than 50% of the populace in Texas. The Republican legislature went into a panic, and in the midst of a lot of highly anti-Hispanic rhetoric, they passed this voter ID law in 2011. Now, in 2011, it was blocked. As soon as it was passed, it was blocked by a local federal district judge. However, the day after the Supreme Court passed the Shelby decision, they implemented this just totally regressive voter ID Act. The result was in Texas, in 2014 election, we had one of the worst voting rates in the United States, with the turnout dropping by 5% from the 2010 election. The Fifth Circuit, that conservative court, held that the photo ID law had an impermissible discriminatory effect against Hispanics and African Americans. The result was, listen to this, 600,000 Texas citizens, the poor, black, Hispanic primarily, 4.5% of all registered voters were denied the right to vote. You want to know how they keep Texas red? They keep it by cheating. They keep it by stopping the Democratic voters from going to the polls. They even passed, the Secretary of State said that college students, such as at the University of Texas in Austin, they could no longer vote in Austin, even though they live there. They could no longer, some of them been there 3, 4, 5 years, could no longer, they had to go back to their home district on that day to vote. Photo IDs from the state university were not allowed, but your gun ID is allowed. So, I mean, it's, you know, the problem is in Texas, we have some very progressive sections of Texas. Houston is very progressive. We have the world's largest medical center. We have the Space Center. But the problem is that the rural counties, the redneck areas that are the base for people like Ted Cruz and Rick Perry and anybody named Bush, are all solid Republican. All those small towns, and the state is so big that they outnumber the big cities, even though we have 3 of the largest metropolitan areas in the United States, with Houston, San Antonio, and Dallas-Fort Worth. But they've elected, through all those rural districts, they elect the Texas governor, the lieutenant governor, the House, the Senate, and really importantly, the Secretary of State, who's appointed, all Republican. And the Texas Supreme Court is simply the political enforcer for the Republican Party. And one last point about Texas, we absolutely love the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is absolutely sacrosanct. You cannot move 1 inch away from it. Not so much with the 13th or 14th or 15th Amendments. You know, I'm sort of like, with the Constitution, I'm kind of like the Ten Commandments. They're really not multiple choice. You don't get to pick your 5 favorites. But the Second Amendment has a lot more power in Texas than the 13th, 14th, or 15th Amendments.
It sure does. And everything you just described of what's happened already in Texas is what they're trying to do in North Carolina. It's also what they're trying to do in Ohio and Wisconsin. I mean, Florida, the list is almost endless. And it's the same blueprint. It's what happened in Texas is what we're going to do everywhere else. Now, we know the truth. Every study that's looked into this, even the Texas court admitted this. You know, look, these voter ID laws, any of these regressive voting laws, it has the explicit purpose of disenfranchising Democratic voters.
Right.
But in the public, and we've only got about a minute left, according to what the Republicans say, this is about stopping all of this rampant voter fraud. Tell us about how bad this problem of voter fraud really is.
Well, let's look at the other big state right now that's in battle right now, waiting for court decisions, which is North Carolina. One of the things that one of their basis for this is they say we're passing this to keep the voter fraud down to a minimum. In going to the North Carolina legislature, the Bureau of Elections testified that since the year 2000, 35 million people had voted in North Carolina. They had exactly two cases out of 35 million of voter impersonation. Now, the fact is that per their own State Board of Elections data, in the voting restrictions, when applied to the 2016 election, 300,000 people will be disenfranchised. 34% of the black registered voters will be disenfranchised. And what they did is they looked at the data from the Board of Elections, and they reverse engineered, they being the legislature, reverse engineered to see to it that 34% of the black registered voters will not make it to the polls to get their constitutional right to vote.
And that's all to stop 2 cases of voter fraud in 15 years. Howard, thank you for telling us this story. This is going to be a major issue as we head into the 2016 election. We are going to keep talking about this because it's got to be stopped. Howard, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure, Farron. Thanks.